So there are a number of critical questions that we have to ask in terms of the development of sub-Saharan African countries. And these critical questions have been avoided, distorted, or kind of misrepresented in the media or in popular culture for the past few years. And it is quite important that we start having a much more logical, proper academic discussion about what we can do about taking Africa forward into the next decade. And some of these critical questions are with regards to education, or perhaps educational reform, the cultural relevance as we go into the next generation, and also governance of the whole continent. So in terms of education, we have to ask the question, is the kind of education offered to the people, the young people of Africa today, ready and able to take them into the labor force in the future? And I'm not sure what the answer is going to be to that question. If you speak to different experts, they will all come up with different answers. But my take on this is we have to recalibrate the educational provision in Africa. We have to ensure that what we are teaching students in Africa are relevant to the overly talk about artificial intelligence for the future, for example. How many of our institutions in Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, Uganda, South Africa, with slight exception there, are going to be able to join the labor force in future? How many of them are going to be able to excel in STEM? And how many of them are going to be able to develop software or equipment or technology that would help the Africa continent as we move from labor-intensive to perhaps automation or capital-intensive production? But also there is a huge talk about why the African culture is of essence to the development of Africa. I don't see that at all. I can hardly pinpoint a country out there in the world that has developed because they have such a marvelous culture. What is the culture of Africa? It's hard to define. What is the culture of even an individual country in Africa, like Nigeria? Nigeria may have different ethnic groups. Ghana may have different ethnic groups. So is Uganda. So is South Africa. So the idea that Africa culture is one is misleading. And even within a country in Africa, we cannot claim that that country has a particular culture that is going to propel the country forward in terms of its development. So we need to move away from this cultural love, cultural appreciation. And I'm not sure how people are going to react to this, but what is the benefit in terms of shouting to the whole world that we have a rich culture, yet that culture doesn't really offer anything in terms of significant development? What is the benefit in accusing the rest of the world all the time that the rest of the world is the reason why Africa is underdeveloped? For example, I have listened recently to a very popular figure trying to blame the IMF and the World Bank for giving loans to Africa that are extremely expensive in terms of the interest rate. But the IMF was set up by institutions outside of Africa with a slight involvement of African countries. You don't go to a bank and decide what interest rate you pay. You are rated based on your ability to pay, default in the past, or other factors. So to say to the whole world that the African nations have been given loans from the IMF and the World Bank that are disproportionately too high compared to the interest rate offered to countries in Europe and America really is popular. It's emotional, but it doesn't take the country forward. It doesn't take the continent forward. And those are things that I think we have to be extremely careful of when we try to discuss issues that affect the development of Africa. So back to the same interest rate issue, why don't we even have an African bank that we will rely on? We accuse the rest of the world for giving an expensive loan instead of thinking of setting up a fund in Africa that will propel the continent forward. So we are constantly moving the argument from one factor to the other and pointing finger at other people and not taking any blame as a continent. There is also a popular belief that the Europeans have underdeveloped Africa. To some extent, we can say, yeah, that is probably true, but we continue to blame other people. What about the resources that we have in Africa? What about the thousands or perhaps tons of natural resources that we have? Go to any country south of the Sahara Desert. You will find tons of forest. This forest is being destroyed by our societies and government. They're selling the timber to other countries. But then you continue to blame other people for coming to buy your timber. Who allows them to come in? Who gives them the visa? It's your own people. It's the government of your country that signs that paper and allows the people to come in and buy your timber and take it away, process it, and sell it back to you. So blaming other people constantly is not really doing much to the development of Africa. We talk about the depletion of resources in Africa. Some of the accusation has been that the Europeans, for example, have taken all the natural resources of Africa and have taken them to develop their country. But although that might be true, you still have a substantial amount of the resources left in the continent of Africa. What are the countries doing with those resources? What are we currently doing? Forget about what happened 300 years ago. Forget about what happened 400 years ago. What about today? What can we do differently to ensure that we are getting the best deal? Secondly, the idea that China is also taking over Africa, I'm not too sure about that. It has always been that trade occurs between two different countries, or three or four. Hence the reason why UK leaving the European Union has been a big talk and has caused so much problem, because trade is better than no trade. The whole idea that we should not allow China to go to Africa to buy resources or to do things the way they are doing currently, it's not the way we should be looking at the argument. We should be looking at the argument in this way. We have to ask our governments in Africa to ensure that when they sign those agreements, they sign the best deal ever. You cannot stop the Chinese from coming to Africa. It's not something that is possible. I have listened to some news on the internet, and people are saying, don't let the Chinese go to Africa because they are stealing the resources of Africa. But this is not looking at the argument properly. The same Chinese are also providing goods to Africa. China produces a lot of electronic products that are used in Africa. Are you going to stop that trade also? Are you going to stop the Chinese from sending goods to your country? Because if you stop them from coming to your country, trade is not one-sided. Trade is two-sided. So for the fact that you see them physically there, buying things that you cherish so much, would you rather have them not come to your country so those resources you have continue to be yours and you don't process them, you don't use them for your own development? I think we need to have a much more detailed conversation about these things and move away from what we see today on Facebook. Anyone can take a camera and start making a video and misleading some people. And the unfortunate incident of Africans being attacked in China, the unfortunate incidents of a counter-reaction in Africa where some Chinese are being attacked in Uganda, for example, it's not going to take the world forward. Buddha has always said it, an eye for an eye leaves the whole world with only one eye. So the whole idea of blaming other people for the lack of development in Africa is a conversation that has to be had in a slightly different way. That will be my position on some of these issues. Certainly there is more to be talked about, but for now, those are my take on the development issues in Africa.